Oftentimes I'm criticized by people who say that the Bible is a stolen book of African history and it should be looked upon as that. But I really think these people have not actually studied the history of this book. If they had studied the history of this book, they would realize that racism didn't begin in the late 1400s into the early 1500s by Europeans, but racism actually towards Black people began in the writing time frame of this so-called African book written of the history of African people. When you come into an understanding of historicity, you will then know that the people that they wanted to dominate, that they were racist towards, was the Black African living in and around the Levant area and in Kemet. For you to truly understand this, you'd have to recognize that this book, the Talmud, was not written until during the late period of the Babylonian captivity and right after the Babylonian captivity. Prior to that, they had no writings. It was in the 500s BCE that these writings were put in place. Now, when you look at the history of that area, you know that it provided trade and was being conquered and reconquered from the Canaanites to the Kemetic people to the Jebusites, possibly an Israelite kingdom, but that's not been verified yet. Then you had the Neo-Assyrians, Neo-Babylonians, the Kemetic Lake period, and then your Neo-Babylonians again, then your Persians, and then you get your kingdoms of Judah when this book has been written after the Persian conquest, and then we move into the Ptolemies, the Greeks, and then the Romans. But prior to all of this, not only was there these people being conquered repeatedly by other kingdoms from outside forces, but they were also greatly involved in different trading with different groups of people from Crete, from Sardis, from Asia, from many different places. So the people, by the time you get to the writing of this book, the people were not dark skinned like me, not dark like the Cushite people. They were caramel. They were cream colored people. They were not your traditional African person. Anytime they mentioned Cush, they referred to Black, the race. And this book promoted the racism of conquering those people and making them into your slaves. As your book says, you can conquer foreigners who live amongst you and foreigners who live in foreign nations and make them into your slave in perpetuity and pass them down for generations. This book, in its earliest stages, advocated for the racist ideas that then the Europeans took upon themselves to add to why they were able to pursue the transatlantic slave trade, why the Arabs, who then later conquered after the Romans, were able to utilize this for the trans-Sahara slave trade in conquering and subjugating and oppressing people of African descent. And when they came to the Americas and saw dark-skinned people, they utilized that same thing to oppress and enslave those ancestors as well. So this is not a book about the African. This is not an African book that has been misused by Europeans. This book was written by a caramel-skinned, light-skinned Levant people in a way that they can then subjugate those who they call the curse of Ham or the curse of Canaan, and subjugate them, and created a story post-flood demonstrating that they have the God-given right to make your ancestors, my ancestors, into slaves simply based on skin tone and not based on anything else. Sure, you're going to say it's tribal, but it's not. It was all about skin tone. Canaan is supposedly the progenitor of the Canaanites, to which they hated, as well as the Cushite people as well, which were the Black people. So therefore, this book is a racist book that goes against the African population and goes against people who look like you and I. So if you continue to pump this book up and say that it is for you, it is only because you grew up with this book. You grew up in a community that supports this book. You grew up in a nation that supports this book. So you will do all that you can to justify it because you are a person who is still living on the hope of freedom, the hope of heaven, the hope that your soul can get into these pearly gates, these streets laden with gold, dressed in your white robe. It is not based on reality. It is not based on truth. It is not based on archaeology. It is not based on what those civilizations looked like and what those civilizations did and the political powers that they held. So if you truly, truly, truly want to free yourself, you have to put this book down and put it in its right category. It is a very racist book towards anyone who has African or indigenous American descent. You got to free yourself to be yourself because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.